He told her the job wasn't meant for a woman. 6 months later, he had no idea how he'd managed without her. It was a cold morning in Yorkshire in the year 1817, when Margaret Halloway presented herself at Redmayne Hall with a leather portfolio of references, a careful letter of application, and 11 years of practical land management learned at her late father's own patient elbow, and was shown into the Duke of Redmayne's study only to be laughed at, gently but unmistakably, within the first 2 minutes of her interview. "You wish to apply for the position of estate steward, Miss Halloway," Percival Redmayne said, and though he did not intend cruelty precisely, the amusement in his voice landed with the same weight regardless. "I confess I have received a great many unusual applications this month, given the state my late steward left this estate in, but I do not believe I have yet received one from a woman." "My father was Josiah Halloway, Your Grace," Margaret said, entirely composed despite the amusement plainly written across the Duke's face, land agent to the Marquis of Elverston for 22 years, until his death last spring. "I worked at his side from the time I was 15 years old, keeping his accounts, walking his drainage surveys, learning his crop rotations first-hand rather than from any book. I can show you, in this portfolio, the precise figures by which Elverston's own rents increased 11% under my father's management, and I can tell you plainly, having walked your own western fields on my way here this morning, exactly what 3 specific failures of drainage and rotation are currently costing you before you have even asked me the question." Percival Redmayne, 36 and still finding his footing beneath the weight of a title he had inherited unexpectedly upon an elder cousin's sudden death, and whose own estate had fallen, in the 2 years since, into a state of mismanagement serious enough to threaten the whole family's standing, found himself briefly, genuinely intrigued by the young woman's plain confidence, and dismissed the interest just as quickly, for a duke's reputation, he reasoned, could not easily survive the county's ridicule of having hired a woman to manage his acreage, whatever her father's credentials. "I have no doubt you learned a great deal at your father's side, Miss Halloway," Percival said, not unkindly but entirely final. "But I cannot in good conscience appoint a woman to a position that requires riding the whole of 4,000 acres, negotiating with tenant farmers who will not take instruction from a woman, and standing before my own board of trustees to defend the estate's management. I have already engaged Mr. Edwin Pratt for the position, a young man of good family connections who comes highly recommended. I wish you well in whatever position better suits your particular circumstances." She had heard some version of that same polite dismissal a dozen times since her father's death the previous spring. From every landholder in 3 counties she had approached with the same careful portfolio and the same plain confidence, and each refusal had cost her a little more than the last, for she had genuinely believed, in the early months, that the sheer thoroughness of her qualifications might eventually outweigh the simple fact of her sex in at least one gentleman's calculation. Her father, Josiah Halloway, had never once treated her differently in the fields for being a girl. He had put her up on a pony before she could properly walk unassisted, and had taken her along on every drainage survey and tenant negotiation from the age of 10, teaching her, patiently and thoroughly, everything a land agent needed to know, not because he had any particular philosophy about a woman's proper place, but because his own wife had died bringing Margaret into the world, and he had no son, and a man needed someone to carry the work forward, and his daughter had shown from her earliest years exactly the patient, careful attention the work required. "The land doesn't care whose skirts brush the furrow, Meg," he had told her once, watching her mark a drainage line with her own small, careful hand at 12 years old. It only cares whether the marking's done right. She had carried that sentence with her through 11 years of practical apprenticeship and a full year now of doors closed politely in her face, and had begun. By the cold November morning she walked into Redmayne Hall to wonder whether the sentiment had been more comfort than truth. Margaret Halloway left Redmayne Hall that morning with her portfolio still in hand, and a cold, clear determination settling in her that the Duke's dismissal, however politely delivered, had done nothing whatsoever to diminish. She did not leave the county. She returned to Redmayne Hall 3 days later and applied instead, with considerably less fanfare, for the position of clerk and assistant to the newly appointed Mr. Pratt, a modest, unremarkable post that raised no eyebrows whatsoever. For a steward's assistant managing correspondence and accounts was precisely the sort of respectable employment a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances might reasonably seek. Edwin Pratt, a genial, entirely unqualified young man of 25, whose chief recommendation had been his mother's friendship with the Duke's own late aunt, and whose entire prior experience of estate business amounted to a single indifferent term managing his own uncle's modest hunting lodge, hired Margaret within the week. Delighted to find so capable seeming an assistant willing to manage the estate's tedious paperwork, while he himself attended to what he considered the more important business of being seen properly about the county in his new position, riding his fine new gelding along the main road each afternoon and dining at every neighbouring house that would receive him. It was, the narrator will tell you plainly, an arrangement built on a considerable and deliberate irony. Margaret Halloway had been turned away from the very position she was now, within a fortnight, performing in full, while the man who held the title and the salary attached to it rode about the estate in fine new boots and left every substantive decision to the clerk he had hired to spare himself the trouble of learning the business properly. Before the first month of that arrangement had concluded, Margaret had already begun the careful, patient work of undoing 2 years of mismanagement, work that would, by spring, transform the whole fortune of Redmayne Hall, though not one soul among the tenants, or the Duke himself, yet understood whose hand truly guided it. If a story of quiet, unthanked excellence finally forcing its own recognition is the kind that keeps you listening, stay, what Margaret Halloway built that winter, working entirely in another man's shadow, changed everything that followed. The clerk's office itself, when she first took up her modest post, proved a cramped, cold room at the rear of the estate office, entirely neglected by a steward who preferred the comfort of the main house to the tedious business of actually inspecting his own accounts. And Margaret set about ordering it within her first week, with the same careful thoroughness she brought to everything, sorting years of disorganized correspondence into a system her father would have recognized at a glance. She began with the drainage her father had trained her to spot at a glance, 3 low fields that had flooded every spring for a decade, drowning good crop yield year after year for want of a properly dug channel system her father had once sketched, in principle, for a similar problem at Elverston. She drew the whole plan herself in the margins of the estate's own working papers, and presented it to Pratt as though it was simply the natural next step in his own management. "An excellent notion, Miss Halloway," Pratt said, barely glancing at the careful diagrams before signing his own name to the authorization. "I had been meaning to address that very problem myself. See that the tenants understand it comes from my own considered judgment, won't you? Wouldn't do to have them thinking their steward hadn't troubled to notice the flooding himself." Margaret said nothing to correct him, understanding, with the same patient calculation that had carried her through 11 years of watching her father's own hard work, occasionally credited to lesser men, that the fields drained and the crops saved mattered a great deal more, in the long accounting, than whose name the tenants attached to the improvement. She worked, through that long winter, with a thoroughness that astonished even herself some evenings, renegotiating 3 ruinous tenancy agreements her predecessor had allowed to fall into arrears through simple neglect, introducing a rotation of turnips and clover on the estate's worst managed acreage that her father had championed for a decade at Elverston with considerable success, and personally riding out, in her plainest travelling habit, to every tenant farm on the estate to hear directly what 2 years of careless management had cost each family, information Pratt himself had never once troubled to gather first-hand. The tenants, wary at first of a steward's clerk asking questions their absent employer never had, came to trust Margaret's quiet, careful attention within a matter of weeks, for she listened to their difficulties with a genuine understanding no gentleman's steward's occasional, careless visit had ever offered them, and acted on what she heard with a swiftness that told them plainly, whatever her official title, that someone at Redmayne Hall finally cared whether their families survived the winter intact. There was a particular satisfaction, Margaret found, in watching the whole tenor of her days shift so thoroughly across that long winter, from a woman turned away at a great house's front door to a woman whose quiet arrival at a struggling farm's gate had come, by February, to mean something considerably warmer to the families who saw her coming. She learned each tenant's particular difficulty with the same patient attention her father had once taught her to bring to every problem, whether it was old widow Tarrant's failing sheep pasture, or the Merrick family's long-running dispute over a shared boundary hedge, and settled each in turn with a fairness that owed nothing to Pratt's occasional careless visits and everything to her own father's careful example. It was old Hob Carrick, whose family had farmed the estate's northern boundary 3 generations, who first said aloud what half the tenants had begun quietly suspecting. "Begging your pardon, Miss Halloway," Carrick said, one bitter February morning, watching her mark the exact spot for a new drainage channel with the same precise, practised eye her father had once taught her, but I've watched 3 stewards come and go on this estate in my time, and not one of them ever walked my own fields in the mud to see the trouble first-hand the way you've done twice this month already. I don't rightly know what Mr. Pratt does with his days, but it isn't this. Margaret said nothing in answer beyond a small, careful smile, though the observation settled in her with a satisfaction she did not entirely trust herself to examine too closely. By March, the estate's accounts, which Margaret herself kept and balanced with the same meticulous precision her father had drilled into her since girlhood, showed a recovery so marked that even Percival Redmayne, occupied largely with his own London affairs through the worst of that winter, could not fail to notice it upon his return. "The rents have improved considerably, Pratt," Percival said, examining the ledgers with genuine, startled pleasure at his own estate's turning fortune. "The drainage on the western fields, the renegotiated tenancies, I confess I did not expect such thorough improvement so swiftly. You have exceeded my expectations entirely. I have worked a good deal of long hours on the estate's behalf, Your Grace," Pratt said, accepting the praise with a modesty that concealed entirely the true source of the improvement. It was Margaret's own careful ledgers, however, that Percival examined most closely in the weeks that followed, and it was there, in the margins of the estate's working accounts, that he began to notice a particular careful hand, a hand that did not match Pratt's own looping, careless script, but a smaller, precise notation running alongside every major decision, working out figures and probabilities with a rigour Percival found himself, increasingly, admiring a great deal more than his steward's official reports. He had returned from London that particular week expecting the usual dispiriting accounting of an estate still struggling under 2 years of neglect, and had instead spent 3 full evenings in his study poring over figures that told an entirely different, considerably more hopeful story, comparing them line by line against the previous steward's own dismal final year until he was satisfied the improvement was genuine and not some trick of creative bookkeeping. "Whose hand is this, Pratt?" Percival asked finally, laying the ledger open between them in the margins beside every one of these decisions. "I do not believe I have seen you write in quite so precise a fashion." Pratt hesitated, caught between the comfortable credit he had enjoyed all winter and the plain fact of the question laid before him. "That would be my clerk's hand, Your Grace." "Miss Halloway." "A capable assistant, I assure you, for the tedious business of copying and calculation, though the decisions themselves were, of course, my own judgment throughout." Percival Redmayne sat back in his chair, a slow, dawning understanding settling over him as he turned back through months of careful, precise margin notes that told a story considerably more thorough than any decision Edwin Pratt had ever demonstrated the judgment to make on his own. "Miss Halloway," Percival repeated slowly. "The same Miss Halloway I turned away from this very study in November." He rode out to find her himself that same afternoon, discovering her at the northern boundary, overseeing the completion of the drainage channel she had first sketched in a margin months before, her plain travelling habit mud splattered, and her whole bearing entirely unlike the composed applicant he remembered, considerably more capable, if anything, having spent a winter proving it in the mud rather than merely claiming it across a desk. "You have been running my estate since November, Miss Halloway," Percival said, without preamble, dismounting beside her, his composed public manner entirely gone, replaced by something rawer and more unguarded than she had yet seen from him. "I turned you away at this very door, told you the position was not meant for a woman, and you simply found another door and did the whole job regardless, letting a man who has done nothing but ride about in fine boots take every ounce of the credit. I have spent the whole ride here trying to decide whether I am more ashamed of my own blindness or more astonished by your patience. And I confess I have not yet settled the question." "I did not do it for the credit, Your Grace," Margaret said, entirely composed despite the plain surprise of his sudden arrival, though her hands, he noticed, gripped the surveying stakes she held a little tighter than the moment strictly required. "I did it because I watched 2 years of careless mismanagement threaten families I had come to know and care for, and because I found I would rather do good work unthanked than watch good land continue to suffer for want of it. My father taught me that the land itself does not care whose name sits on the steward's ledger, only whether the work is done properly. I confess I did not expect, undertaking it, that the truth would surface quite this way, or quite this soon." "Your father sounds a very wise man," Percival said, and something in his composed astonishment had begun, visibly, to shift into something considerably warmer. "I find I owe you a very great deal more than an apology, Miss Halloway. I find I owe you your rightful position, and considerably more besides. Before the estate's tenants could finish speculating over the Duke's sudden frequent presence at the northern fields, there began, between Percival Redmayne and the woman who had rebuilt his fortune from another man's shadow, a private reckoning that would take the whole of that spring to properly settle. If a story of quiet excellence finally, publicly claimed, is the kind that keeps you listening, stay. What Percival chose to do with the truth changed the whole shape of Redmayne Hall. He did not dismiss Pratt outright. at first judging it wiser to gather the whole clear proof before acting, a caution that proved, as the weeks unfolded, entirely warranted, for Edwin Pratt, sensing the ground shifting dangerously beneath his comfortable arrangement, did not accept the coming reckoning quietly. He came to Percival directly, before the Duke could act on his own suspicions, with a carefully constructed accusation of his own that Miss Halloway, given unsupervised access to the estate's accounts these many months, had in fact been quietly diverting small sums for her own benefit, a pattern he claimed to have only just discovered upon closer examination of her own careful ledgers, and that her elaborate improvements to the estate's fortunes had conveniently obscured a steady, ongoing theft beneath the general prosperity. "I did not wish to believe it of her, Your Grace," Pratt said, with a performance of reluctant regret that very nearly convinced Percival entirely, "but the figures do not lie. I have marked the discrepancies myself. Quite substantial over the winter's accounting. It was a bold, desperate gambit, calculated precisely to strike before Margaret's own competence could be publicly and permanently established, and Pratt had chosen his moment with care, arriving at the hall the very evening Percival's own solicitor happened to be present on unrelated business. Ensuring the accusation would carry the immediate weight of formal witness rather than mere gossip, and presenting his fabricated discrepancies with a wounded, reluctant sorrow that struck Percival in that first unguarded hour as considerably more convincing than it deserved to be. It very nearly succeeded. A duke newly humbled by his own misjudgment of a capable woman found himself, for one uncertain evening, caught in a painful uncertainty he had not expected to feel again so soon, wondering whether his admiration, formed so quickly and so thoroughly over a single winter's evidence, had blinded him to a deception considerably more damaging than mere unclaimed credit. He did not sleep well that night, turning the accusation over against everything he had witnessed of Margaret's character in the preceding months, and found himself, by dawn, angry at his own doubt and unable, regardless, to fully set it aside without proper proof, one way or the other. Margaret, summoned to answer the accusation before Percival and his own solicitor, did not panic, though the accusation's gravity was plain enough to frighten a lesser resolve entirely. She asked, instead, for a single evening to examine Pratt's claimed discrepancies against her own original working papers, and returned the following morning with her father's own leather-bound ledger, a worn, careful record of land management principles and figures he had kept across 22 years at Elverston, annotated in his own hand with the exact methods by which he had trained his daughter to track every farthing an estate's accounts touched, cross-referenced and double-entered precisely to guard against exactly this kind of accusation. Mr. Pratt's claimed discrepancies do not exist in my original working papers, Your Grace, Margaret said, laying both ledgers open before the assembled company, her voice steady, though the accusation had cost her a sleepless night of her own preparing this very defence. They exist only in his own recent recopying of certain entries, made, I would wager, in the past 3 days, since he learned you had discovered whose hand truly guided this estate's recovery. My father taught me to double-enter every figure precisely because a dishonest man's altered copy is easy enough to produce, but a consistent, cross-referenced original is a great deal harder to falsify convincingly. She turned the pages methodically, walking the solicitor through each disputed entry with a patience that made the fraud's clumsiness increasingly plain to every eye in the room. Compare the ink, Your Grace, and the hand, and you will find Mr. Pratt's supposed discoveries were written considerably more recently than the dates he has claimed for them. My own father spent 22 years building a reputation no dishonest employer or rival agent ever once managed to successfully challenge, precisely because he taught me never to keep a single unverified record of anything that mattered. I did not survive 11 years at his side without learning exactly how a false accusation is built, and exactly how it is unbuilt again. Percival's solicitor, examining the 2 sets of papers with a trained, careful eye, confirmed within the hour precisely what Margaret had predicted. Fresh ink on paper claimed to be months old, a hand that grew visibly less careful and more hurried as the fabricated entries progressed, the whole clumsy fraud unravelling under the same rigorous cross-referencing Josiah Halloway had built his entire reputation upon. Edwin Pratt, cornered before the evidence of his own desperate fabrication, abandoned any pretence of injured innocence and attempted, instead, a final, blustering appeal to the unfairness of a system that had let a woman's work go unrecognised in the first place, as though his own theft of that unrecognised work somehow excused the fresh crime of trying to bury her beneath a lie to protect it. You would have let her hang for embezzlement, Pratt, to protect a salary you did nothing to earn, Percival said, cold and absolute. I do not know which offends me more thoroughly, that you stole a season's credit from the one person actually saving this estate, or that you were prepared to see her ruined entirely rather than simply admit the truth honestly. You are dismissed, effective this hour, and I will be informing every landholder of my acquaintance exactly why, so that no estate in this county mistakes your good family connections for good character again. It was that same afternoon, once Pratt's dismissal was fully settled and Margaret's name finally, properly cleared before witnesses, that Percival Redmayne found her once more at the northern drainage channel, the completed work running clean and true through fields that had flooded every spring for a decade before her arrival. I owe you the position outright, Miss Halloway, and a salary considerably better than the clerk's wage you have been quietly earning it for, Percival said, and I intend to offer you both, properly, this time, before the whole county rather than behind a closed study door. But I find, standing here, that I want to offer you something else besides, and I do not entirely know how to ask it without the position complicating the asking. You might simply ask plainly, Your Grace, Margaret said, with the ghost of the same dry composure that had first caught his attention in that November study. I have found plain speaking generally serves better than careful manoeuvring, in my experience. Their courtship, over the weeks that followed the reckoning with Pratt, grew alongside Margaret's own newly public role at Redmayne Hall, Percival riding out with her now, openly, to inspect the estate's continued recovery, learning. At her patient elbow, the same way she had once learned at her father's, the particulars of drainage and rotation and tenant welfare he had never once troubled to master himself before her arrival. I begin to understand why you fought so hard to do this work unrecognised rather than simply give it up when I turned you away, Percival admitted one bright April afternoon, watching Margaret explain the season's crop rotation to a tenant family with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything. I have spent 2 years believing an estate managed itself so long as a gentleman's name sat properly atop the ledger. I find I have learned more from watching you these past weeks than from any tutor my own father ever hired me. Land does not manage itself for anyone, Your Grace, gentleman or otherwise, Margaret said, though there was warmth beneath the familiar dry correction now. It only ever rewards whoever troubles to actually look at it closely enough to understand what it needs. There came an afternoon, some weeks into that deepening acquaintance, when the two of them, dismounting after a long ride along the estate's eastern boundary, found themselves standing close at the edge of a hayfield turning gold in the spring light, neither moving to widen the small distance that had settled between them. "I find myself wanting to close what remains between us, Margaret," Percival said, low. "And I find myself considerably less certain how a duke properly asks such a thing of a woman who has already proven she needs no man's rescue or permission for anything at all." "You might simply ask, Your Grace," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its usual steadiness, "the same plain way you have learnt to ask about drainage and rotation these past weeks. I find I have grown rather fond of your plain asking. It would have taken nothing at all, in that suspended golden moment, for Percival to close the last of the distance entirely, but a rider approaching from the direction of the hall, come to fetch him for some pressing estate correspondence, broke the moment before either of them could complete it, and both of them stepped back, breathless and faintly laughing at the timing, the warmth of the near miss carrying them through the weeks that followed, even as Pratt's growing desperation gathered, unseen, toward its dangerous conclusion. "Then plainly, I have fallen in love with the woman who rebuilt my whole fortune from another man's shadow and asked for nothing but the work itself in return," Percival said. "I do not know how a duke properly courts the steward who manages his own estate, Margaret, but I find I would like to learn, if you will have the trying." The kiss she gave him then, at the edge of the drainage channel her own patient work had carved through years of neglect, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Margaret was the plain astonishment of watching a man who had once laughed her out of his study become the one person who finally, thoroughly, saw the whole of what she was capable of. Edwin Pratt left the county within the month, his own family's connections proving insufficient to secure him another steward's post anywhere in 3 shires once the full particulars of his fraud became known. And the last anyone in Yorkshire heard of him, he had taken a modest clerkship in a distant city, considerably diminished from the comfortable position his mother's friendship had once so easily secured him. Word of the whole affair travelled through the county with the particular speed such reversals always find, and the same landholders who had once politely turned Margaret away over that long difficult year of applications found themselves by summer sending careful letters requesting her advice on their own struggling acreage, a reversal Margaret received with considerably more grace than the earlier rejections had ever shown her, answering each inquiry thoroughly and without a trace of the old bitterness, for she had learned, watching her own fortunes turn, that a person's worth rarely needed vindication to remain true, only patience enough to let the truth eventually be seen. Old Hob Carrick, who had been the first tenant to say plainly what the whole estate had come slowly to understand, stood as an honoured guest at the wedding that followed, and told anyone who would listen, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had called the truth early, that he had known Miss Halloway for the real steward of Redmayne Hall long before any duke or fraudulent clerk had. Troubled to catch up to the fact. They were married the following autumn at the small Yorkshire church nearest the hall. The whole estate's tenants turned out to witness a match considerably more celebrated among them than any grander society wedding could have managed, and Margaret Redmayne continued to manage the estate's fortunes herself, openly and by full title now. Her father's worn ledger kept always close at hand on her own study desk, its careful annotations added to steadily across the years that followed by a daughter who had proven, beyond any further doubting, exactly what her father's patient teaching had built in her. Percival, for his part, made a standing practice, for the whole of his marriage, of riding the estate's boundaries alongside his wife rather than leaving its daily management entirely to another's judgment, having learned, at considerable cost and greater reward, exactly what a duke's careless trust in the wrong hands could nearly cost a whole community of families who depended on the land being properly tended. Their own daughter, born the second year of their marriage, was taught to ride at her mother's own patient elbow from the time she could properly sit a pony, and grew up understanding, long before she needed the lesson plainly stated, that the land did not care whose skirts brushed the furrow, only whether the marking was done right, her grandfather's own sentence. Carried forward now a full generation further than the man who first spoke it could have imagined. The tenants of Redmayne Hall, who had come to trust her quiet competence through a hard winter's mud and careful listening, found in her, for the whole of her long tenure, a steadiness no title or credit had ever needed to validate, only the land itself, properly tended, which had never once cared. Exactly as her father always said, whose name sat atop the ledger, only whether the work was done right.